Hi, my name is Ray. Welcome back to another episode of Ray's Economics Club. Today, we're talking about savings and investment spending and talking about how that is incorporated within our financial system. So let's look at our financial system and the cycle that it is within our economy. Now, we're not going to go too into detail about this right now. Most of it is pretty logical stuff and things that you might already be somewhat familiar with. However, basically, a financial system is between lenders and savers and borrowers and spenders, and they're connected by financial markets and financial intermediaries such as commercial banks or other similar institutions. And these institutions work by taking funds or savings perhaps from lenders and transfer them as funds such as the form of loans or credit to our borrowers and spenders. And then in return, borrowers and spenders invest perhaps in illiquid, sometimes riskier assets, which goes back eventually to lenders and savers. And this is just a cycle of capital and of financial capital basically within our economy that it keeps it working efficiently. It helps transfer funds to those who need it the most. And so eventually our funds we see here goes from savers to spenders, and then there are some transaction costs and risk, but they are all lowered through this financial system model, and liquidity increases by taking funds from the people most willing to give them usually to the most people most willing to use them or needing them. So now we see basically a financial model, and of course our financial model is based a lot on saving. And then from savings you can derive a very fundamental, foundational identity within our economy, and that's the savings, investment, spending identity. Now this is pretty a self-explanatory name. The savings, investment, spending identity implies that savings and investment spending are somewhat related, and in this case they're equal to each other in some context, and we'll see why right now. So in a closed economy, which is the more simpler way of analyzing things, a closed economy of no trade, no interaction with outside foreign economies, we see this. We see that our total income is total spending, and total income, of course, is fundamental. All spending eventually becomes income for our four-factor incomes, and so total income is total spending. And so in a closed economy, we don't have an X in our GDP calculations because we don't have trade. And so our GDP in a closed economy is C plus I plus G, consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending. And so we come to our first use of savings. We have private savings. Private savings are basically our GDP plus our government transfers, TR, minus our tax payments to the government, and minus our consumption. Now, why is this the case? Well, GDP, we see here, GDP, total income is total spending. So total factor income in an economy equals total spending, which means it equals GDP. GDP is our total income, factor income, which is basically all our revenue available to savers in the economy. And then, of course, combine that with government transfers, that's basically our total revenue available for savers. Now, of course, savers also have to reduce their savings because they spend most of that probably, that revenue, and they also send some of that revenue to the government through taxation. So what's left over of that is our private savings. Now we see our government savings. Government savings are basically, in a way, can be interpreted as our government deficit in some contexts. The reason for this is it's basically our tax revenue in the government minus total government transfers minus government spending. So what's left over is basically our deficit, which is basically, a deficit and government savings. And so as a result, in a closed economy, national savings, which is a critical context in this equation, national savings is basically total private savings plus total government savings, because that's all the savings in this economy, which equals GDP minus C minus G, mathematically speaking, once we eliminate everything. Of course, what's left over is our I, investment spending. So mathematically speaking, from our equations about GDP and savings and everything else, and private and government savings, we can deduce that national savings equals investment spending. So that's our closed economy. So let's look at some real-life examples in the theoretical context of closed economies. Now we see here, let's say we have a budget surplus. If we have a budget surplus, and we see here our budget surplus, which is our government savings, plus our private savings equals what I see here, our investment spending. If we have a budget deficit, which means our spending surpasses our government tax revenue, which is the case here in the United States, then our investment spending equals our private savings overall. Now, private savings involves a negative amount of our budget deficit right here. So that's our graph right here. This whole thing is labeled as private savings. Now let's talk about our open economy. Open economy, of course, is the economy that basically most countries have. It's a type of economy we haven't heard in the U.S. obviously. And first of all, natural savings in the open economy is still the same thing. It's private savings plus government savings. However, the more specific details are a bit modified from the closed economies. We see here is GDP minus C minus G. However, then this equals I plus IM minus X. Now you might remember IM minus X. IM is imports, X is exports. And X minus IM is our total trade deficit, which is what we use to calculate GDP in the open economy. So we have a question mark here. Our question is, why do we use the opposite of a trade deficit? Why do we use basically our import minus exports instead of our net exports, which is what we're supposed to be using supposedly for GDP? Well, the reason of this is because we have two accounts in our economy, our financial account and our current account. Our current account is basically our foreign trade, perhaps, or trade deficit. A trade deficit is always the inverse of our financial account deficit or surplus. So basically, a trade deficit equals a financial account surplus. Our financial account is basically our total inflows and outflows of financial capital or perhaps savings to foreign countries or from foreign countries. So I minus X in this context is our financial account surplus or difference, which is. So basically, that is what's critical because financial accounts represent our foreign savings. And so our savings that are used, obviously, are national savings. So from an open economy, investment spending equals our national savings plus basically our financial account difference or surplus. So SP plus SG plus KI, our surplus. So let's look at real life examples because real life we have open economies. The United States is pretty notorious for having pretty low private savings among most developed nations. The United States, we see here our investment spending equals our capital inflows because we have a trade deficit. However, the inverse of that is that we have a financial account surplus that is rather large. And so we have a lot of capital inflows, a lot of foreign savings come to our nation, combining with our private savings, which of course combines with our budget deficit and makes up for our budget deficit to equal our investment spending. Now, on the other side, we have Japan. Japan is notorious, or just famous perhaps, for its extremely high private savings. In fact, this leaks over to its foreign interactions. It has a net foreign outflow of financial capital. It saves so much that it starts saving other countries a lot more than it takes in savings or financial capital from other countries. So it has a financial account deficit and it has a budget deficit just like the US. And so as a result, its private savings are massive and makes up for its outflows and budget deficit to equal its investment spending. So finally, Ray's final conclusion is that the financial system is here to promote efficiency through reducing risk, reducing transaction costs, and providing liquidity, and helping match savers and lenders. Helping match savers and spenders. And so from the savings we can derive a savings investment spending identity, because we can see that since income equals spending or inflow equals outflow, if we dig deeper and find more specific aspects of why this is the case through our GDP equations, then thus we can derive this saving investment spending identity through our financial systems and its savings. So that's our video for today, and thank you and see you next time. Bye bye.